Canada's environment watchdog is warning that federal efforts to map flood risk areas across the country are falling short. A new audit by Jerry DeMarco found that although the government did identify higher risk areas in 2022, fewer than half of flood mapping projects underway actually target them. That report is one of 3 released today by the Federal Environment and Sustainable Development Commissioner. And Jerry DeMarco joins me now to walk us through what he and his team found out. Commissioner, thanks for making time for us today.
Thanks for inviting us.
So let's start with flood mapping. Your audit found that the federal government was too slow to produce flood hazard maps, that many were incomplete, and that much of the information was either not accessible or usable or practical. What does that mean for Canadians as they're facing growing flooding risk right now?
Yeah, so planning ahead is crucial now as Canada's climate has been warming at twice the global average. We can't just extrapolate from the past to determine where areas might be flooding, but we need to make some forecasts as to how our climate will change and how that will affect precipitation, water levels, and so on. So it's quite important to have up-to-date, timely, reliable, and usable information for Canadians as they may consider buying a house, the most important financial decision of many Canadians' lives, and so on. So having up-to-date information is crucial for protecting their property and ultimately protecting lives.
And on that note, you also looked at a federal portal meant to inform the public about flood risk. You found that somehow it doesn't actually account for how climate change is shifting flood patterns. How is that possible, and how significant is that omission, that failing?
Yeah, so that's a major weakness in the portal. The portal is actually not quite launched yet. If you go onto the website of Public Safety, you just see an area where you can put in your address to find out about flood risk, but it's still grayed out saying coming soon. But we were able to look at a prototype of it, and that prototype does not factor in climate change scenarios. So it's helpful to be able to look at where areas have flooded in the past and make some decisions on that. But with our changing climate, we need to look at what's likely to happen in the future. Even though there's some uncertainty around that, it's not an exact science projecting the future climate. So that portal needs to be revamped so that it's more useful for Canadians making long-term decisions like purchasing a house, or for developers building a new subdivision, or for infrastructure planners deciding where to put in new roads, new culverts, new bridges, that sort of thing.
But why is it that the government wasn't actually keeping in mind how climate change is shifting those patterns?
Yeah, so for the other project that we looked at in this report, they are factoring in climate change for the high resolution maps. But for the portal, they acquired a model from a private sector organization in order to get the portal running sooner rather than later, but it has these limitations of not being able to factor in climate change and not being easily updated with new information.
Right. Your team also examined how the government is protecting federal assets, things like bridges, harbors, roads, buildings, etc., from climate change risks, how to mitigate those risks. The government did launch a strategy to that end in 2017, but you found that key commitments were often missed or pushed away entirely. What went wrong there? Why weren't they able to meet those commitments?
Yeah, so climate resilience, which is essentially getting ready by adapting to your infrastructure for the coming climate, whether it's higher floodwaters, forest fires, and so on. That's important because ultimately the federal government is the largest owner of non-financial assets in Canada, physical assets like bridges and so on, and therefore it's essentially the taxpayer who owns those things. So if we are to protect those assets from being destroyed or damaged in the future, we need to act quickly in the context of Canada's climate changing to protect them. There's been a lag in terms of moving from assessing risks to creating resilience plans to implementing those plans, such that they've now pushed off their ambition around implementing resilience efforts to 2035 and 2040. But that will just cost more in the future, more for taxpayers, and more risk of damage to these assets.
Nearly 2/3 of those assets are managed by just 3 departments, according to your report, right? National Defense, Public Services and Procurement, and Fisheries and Oceans. Your audit found, as you were saying, that they did identify the climate risk, but that they did very little to mitigate them. I know it's obviously there's a whole basket of assets there, but how would you say, generally speaking, those assets are now exposed or further exposed to climate risk because of that lag?
Yeah, so take for instance a building close to a floodplain. If you're going to require, if you're going to put into place climate resilience efforts, you may be putting in bank stabilization or other things to protect that asset. Without those measures, those assets are at risk of being damaged or destroyed. And when you look at the full portfolio of assets that the federal government has, it's a huge amount. We looked at over 1,000 critical assets and found that only 3% of those that had been identified as at risk had resilience plans in place. So their efforts are still quite limited, considering the scale of the problem and the pace at which the climate of Canada is changing.
Mm. The third and final report that you and your team published today has to do with the government's response to bird flu, obviously a highly contagious virus that spreads from wild birds to livestock, pets, and in some cases people. You did find that the Canadian Food Inspection Agency did handle the outbreaks well. It tripled the number of samples it collected each year when the outbreak first appeared in Canada in 2021. But you did raise concerns about what could happen without dedicated funding. Can you walk us through those concerns and the implications?
Yeah, so bird flu is a concern sort of in three different areas. Out in the nature with migratory birds carrying the flu, in farms with poultry and other potential farm animals having it, and then ultimately the possibility that humans can have it. Thankfully, not very many humans have caught it in the last few years worldwide, but there has even been one case in Canada where someone had it. So looking at the wild birds, they were, as you said, Environment and Climate Change Canada, able to triple its sampling efforts and get a better handle on what species were carrying the influenza virus and so on. But they did that by cobbling together money from other programs that was available. And that's getting more difficult to do in these times of constraint. So we are concerned about the sustainability of those efforts and also the lack of any focused efforts on endangered and threatened species. Probably the most important or endangered species that we know have contracted bird flu is the whooping crane, and there's only in the hundreds of those left. There's not very many left. If bird flu becomes another threat to that, along with habitat loss and so on, then that could potentially be devastating for that species. And there are many, many other species that are also susceptible to bird flu.
Your audit also found that the Public Health Agency of Canada secured 870,000 doses of a bird flu vaccine for people at high risk, so people like farmers, veterinarians. The government later determined it actually needed far fewer number of doses, around 300,000. But more than 95% of the 870,000 doses went unused. They expired by February. What does that tell you about how the Public Health Agency handled vaccine procurement in this case and the lessons learned going forward?
Yeah, so hindsight is 20/20. We know that they obviously bought way more than were used. 95% were wasted. It is perplexing that when their first batch was procured and not very many were used, they still went and bought another 300,000+ doses. So what we'd like to do is, okay, well, that's water under the bridge, that those vaccines were wasted. Let's learn from that for the next outbreak of avian flu, or for that matter, some other virus, and plan better rather than waiting for the next emergency and then cobble together a plan at that time. So if we've learned anything from avian flu, COVID, SARS, H1N1, and so on, it's that being ready is better than just reacting at the time. If you just react, you can have situations like this where 800,000+ doses were acquired, but only 5% were used.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Jerry DeMarco, Commissioner of the Environment and Sustainable Development. We'll leave it there. Thanks so much for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you.